Good afternoon and welcome back for lesson 2 in our main idea and details unit. Yesterday we started off by discussing how to identify supporting details and how to use those details to make inferences, draw conclusions, as well as touch on the topic of analyzing a text. Today we're going to dig a little bit deeper into textual analysis and look at some tips and tricks that we can use when we are reading through a text to ensure that we are effectively analyzing the information that is presented to us. So our goals for the lesson today are first to understand what analysis is and how to analyze a text. We're going to learn how to identify quotations that support analysis of literary and informational texts. Understand the difference between primary and secondary resources, and then finally use evidence to support analysis of informational texts. So let's kind of recap a little of the information that we discussed yesterday. So analysis just simply means that we are breaking something down into its component parts, its individual pieces. And we are looking at how they function in relation to each other, as well as how they function together as a whole. So to put it in simple terms, what we are trying to do is we look at the details as individual functioning parts of the text that come together to help us identify specific ideas that maybe the author is presenting, or different lessons that he or she wants us to learn from that text. So when our analysis is well reasoned, in other words, it's well thought out, and we have looked at each of the details carefully, it leads us to deeper understanding and better decision making when it comes to working with those texts. So analysis really isn't something new. The way that we analyze things like a potential construction site, or analyzing something that we want to draw. As we start to consider some of those different components that maybe we're putting into the drawing, how is that going to affect the overall mood and message of that drawing? It's very similar to what we do with analyzing a reading passage. So effective analysis requires us going beyond just simply identifying the main ideas or the explicit details within the text. We need to use these elements to support our own conclusions. In order to have an effective conclusion, it has to be grounded in evidence, and those details provide that evidence. Effectively analyzing a text means that you should be able to identify the explicit details in the text, the stuff that is directly stated. To effectively analyze, you need to be able to pick those details out. You also need to be able to connect details to inferences and conclusions. So use those details as evidence to support your own thoughts about maybe what the author is trying to say. And then finally, identify main ideas and supporting details in a paragraph. So all of these are necessary components of analysis. One thing that we can do to gather our evidence is to identify quotations. All right, so who can tell me what a quotation is?
Those two dashes that are on either side, quotation mark.
Something you bullshit out of text But you have to make sure you say who said it.
Okay, so, for example.
Yeah, it pretty much lets you know who said that. Like that's the words that place that.
So that will be an example of a quotation. We are directly quoting someone. So we may be familiar with that from our time in school with having to do research papers, for example. When it comes to a reading passage, specifically when we talk about quotations, what we are looking for are explicit details from the text. So if you have an idea or a claim that you are making, you can use quotations from that text to support your evidence, to support your ideas. How many of you have had to write research papers before when you were in school?
I mean, I have.
Okay, just about everybody in here should have at some point had to write either a research paper or write some kind of a paper where you had to use quotes and citations. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
You had to cite specifically where you got it from. How many of you were confused about how you were supposed to use those citations in your writing? As far as the format that you had to use. And you get points knocked off if it wasn't in the right format.
I get confused a lot.
Okay? Just about all of us do. Well, I have good news for you. You don't have to worry about that stuff on the TABE test. But the TABE is going to ask you questions where you will need to identify specific things in a text that would be the best example of evidence for an inference or evidence for a conclusion. So this is where that analysis, specifically identifying quotes, is going to come in. So quotation, of course, is also important for understanding and argumentation. So if you are making an argument about a particular claim, if you are trying to support an argument, you need to have evidence, you need to have details, you need to have quotes. Once again, it requires accuracy. So if you're directly quoting from a text, you want to make sure that it is accurate. Accuracy demonstrates your own attention to detail, and it also demonstrates your ability to pick up on that information that is directly said in the text and be able to use it to craft your own ideas about what the author means. That's going to require judgment and point of view. Only thing is, this slows the reading process, because as you think critically about a text, you have to take the time to actually think, and sometimes you may even have to read that text over and over. So quotations, when we use them, can represent explicit information. Normally they are going to involve particular facts. I know, Matthew, when we were talking about details yesterday, one of the things that you pointed out is that details within informational text, for example, are factual information. So these are going to require us to identify those specific facts. So how do we use quotation in reading? Well, we use it to support analysis. We use it for argumentation, and we use it to make inferences. Not only that, but quotation also helps to provide persuasive evidence. So if we have a particular thought or idea, we can use this evidence to help persuade people to see our point of view and maybe even agree with our point of view. So let's work through a couple of examples on IXL and see if we can identify details quoted from the text to support the stated inference. Alright, so the following text is about two boys, Bud and Jerry, who are going to new foster homes. Select the best detail to show Jerry is alarmed at the idea of living with 3 girls. Now that the school year has ended, you both have been accepted in new temporary care homes starting this afternoon. Jerry asked the same thing I was thinking. Together? She said, "Why no, Jerry, you'll be in a family with 3 little girls." Jerry looked like he had just found out they were going to dip him in a pot of boiling milk. So the inference that has been stated is that Jerry is alarmed at the idea of living with 3 little girls. So, which quote from this text supports that claim?
The last one.
Okay, what does the last one say?
Gary looked like he just found out they were going to dip him in a pot of boiling milk.
Okay. So I wonder what that would look like. You know, being dipped in a pot of boiling milk doesn't really sound too pleasant to me. So yes, you are correct. This quote best supports the claim that Jerry is alarmed. All right, let's take a look at another example. In the following text, a boy named Peter is about to board a boat. Select the best detail to show the wharf where ship's dock is crowded. "Sir," he said, "is that our ship?" Peter was thinking of trying to run away, but he didn't know if that was possible. To run away from away. In any event, he didn't see much opportunity for escape. There were sailors and deckhands everywhere. Or excuse me, sailors and dock hands everywhere. So we want to know which detail, which quote from this text best supports this inference that the wharf where ship's dock is crowded.
He didn't see much opportunity to escape. There were sailors and deckhands everywhere.
All right, very good. So there were sailors and dock hands everywhere. So we get that image of people just being all over the place. It's crowded, very difficult to move around. So excellent work. Nate was used to his legs hanging off the end of his bed. He didn't mind pants that hid him above his ankles and shirt sleeves that barely went past his elbows. But having to duck under doorways was hard to get used to.
Nate is very tall.
All right, what details, what quotes in the passage can you use to support that idea?
Having a duck under a doorway.
Okay, so having to duck under doorways.
Like, that's number 1 right there. A short person wouldn't have to do that.
Okay. Are there any other details that,
Pants hit him above the ankles. Shirt sleeves that barely went past his elbows.
all right, pants that hit him above the ankles, shirt sleeves that barely went past his elbows. Okay, so all 3 of those details do support this idea that Nate is very tall. Now, why wouldn't it support the idea that his bed is broken?
Because it wouldn't make no sense.
Because that has nothing to do with him being short.
If you look at the first sentence, his legs hang off the end of his bed. Okay, maybe that could potentially support the idea that his bed was broken. But we can't just use one detail detail for support. We have to use several. All of the other details tend to point to the idea that Nate is very tall.
Could have outgrew his bed too.
What's that?
They would also mean that he outgrew his bed.
Yes, you're exactly right. Okay, let's look at one more example. So Erica set her full bucket down next to Lucy's nearly empty one. What happened, Erica asked. Lucy shrugged and wiped her purple-stained mouth on her shirt.
She ate 'em.
I guess I'm not very good at finding blackberries, she said. So based on the text, which is most likely true?
Lucy ate most of the blackberries she found.
Okay, so what specific details in the text would help you conclude that?
Wiped her purple stained mouth on her shirt.
Okay, so purple stained mouth.
Then her bucket was almost empty.
Alright, so Lucy had a nearly empty one. So the nearly empty bucket could support the idea that the bucket had a hole in the bottom. But when we take into consideration the purple stained mouth, does the bucket with a hole in the bottom make as much sense as Lucy ate most of the blackberries she found?
It don't make much sense.
Right. So, based on the information given, we can conclude that Lucy ate most of the blackberries she found. So, excellent work. So when we consider an informational text, what I mean by components, let's write a couple of examples up here so that you have an idea of what I'm referring to. So titles, headings,
Well, those are the same things, kind of.
Pictures?
yes, images or graphics. No, the title refers to the overall title of the document.
Okay.
The headings are kind of how the topics are broken down into smaller areas. Yes, subtitles. Paragraph structure is another example. How are the paragraphs laid out? And then of course, explicit details, stuff that is stated directly in the text. And then the implicit details, which are those things that are implied, that require us to use critical thinking to determine. So when we analyze, what we are doing is we are breaking these components down, as well as the main ideas and supporting details, to see how they separately and together work. So we use this information together to help us understand the author's reasoning and understand the effectiveness of the text. So these textual elements are often going to function as evidence. So all of this together gives us solid evidence. And a common question that you will be asked on the tape is to determine which detail provides the best evidence for the claim. Or they will give you evidence and say which inference is best supported by this detail. As we analyze text, we need to be able to identify sources within the text. There are typically two types of sources that you are going to encounter. They will either be primary sources or secondary sources. So who can tell me what a primary source is?
Isn't that like a textbook or something like that?
First person.
Or a person?
Elaborate a little more. When you say a person, what do you mean?
Like if you're asking like a teacher or someone who knows something about that subject, or,
Or seeing something through their own eyes.
yeah.
Seeing something through whose own eyes?
Depending whether it's an author or a movie. Some are a game, they would sometimes put it to the point where you're actually in that situation.
Okay. You're hitting pretty close. Someone who is an eyewitness to an event, for example, will be considered a primary source. So in writing, when we talk about primary sources, these are going to include like the letters and writings of a historical figure, or just a historical person. It can also include, like you were talking about, Gio, the eyewitnesses, so eyewitness accounts. Also, government documents. Now, what are secondary sources?
Something like newspapers or headlines.
Okay, yeah, a newspaper would be a good example. They could be reporting information from eyewitnesses. So the purpose of a secondary resource is to take those primary resources and compile that information together. Sam, you mentioned textbooks a little while ago. Those are also a good example of secondary sources. They can provide information or present information from primary sources, but they are not the first-hand accounts themselves. Some examples of secondary sources besides textbooks or newspaper articles.
Biographies.
Yeah, biographies are also an excellent secondary source. Scholarly articles, commentary articles, and reviews of others' work. And then I mentioned government documents present data and statistics and things like that.
One? Like the political documents and stuff like that for like elections and.
Those would actually be considered primary sources.
Huh.
Typically when statistics and data are being reported like that, in most cases, or in some cases, they could be a primary source, and others they could be a secondary source. In science and technical texts, data from an experiment or readings from a technical instrument will be considered a primary source. So like voting records, for example, would be considered a primary source because these readings are taken from the voting machines. So what's the big deal about sources? Why is it so important to know what they are and to be able to identify the differences between them? In order to do effective analysis, we need to be able to consult both primary and secondary sources and be able to identify the difference between the two in order to formulate our own claims and ideas. All right, let's take a look at the information we are presented. Historians use different kinds of sources to study the past. Sources are books, documents, pictures, or other materials that provide evidence about the past. Primary sources are usually first-hand accounts and are usually created at the time that an event takes place. Secondary sources are usually second-hand accounts, are usually created later in time, and are based on a variety of primary sources. Imagine that you are a historian who wants to learn more about African American baseball leagues in the mid 1900s. You find the source described below. Read the description of the source, then complete the sentence below. A program was given to people who attended a baseball game between the Indianapolis Clowns and the Kansas City Monarchs in the 1950s. These teams played in an African American baseball league. So in this case, the program is what? A primary source or a secondary source? To help us determine this, when was the program created? Okay, so it was created in the 1950s. What is the purpose of the program?
It's for baseball game, or?
Yeah, it was for a particular baseball game. And who was the program given to?
Indianapolis Clowns and Kansas City Monarchs.
Okay, the Indianapolis Clowns and the Kansas City Monarchs were the two teams that were playing on this particular date in the 1950s. So the program, of course, was about that particular game. But who did the program actually get handed to? All right, look at the first statement. A program was given to people who attended a baseball game between the Clowns and the Monarchs in the 1950s. So the program was given to people who attended the game. So this program was created for the fans that were in attendance. So since it was created in the 1950s and given out during this game, we can conclude that this was a primary source. So the program is a primary source because it was made for fans at an African American League baseball game in the mid-1900s. All right, let's look at one more example. So remember, a primary source is a first-hand account that is made during the time that the event happens. The secondary source is something that is created after the fact, maybe created at a much later time. So imagine that you are a historian who wants to learn more about monuments made in Persia during the 500s BCE. You find the source described below. Read the description of the source, then complete the sentence below. A large stone cylinder praising the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great was made in Persia during the 500s BCE. So, when was the stone cylinder made?
BC.
Okay, and when was Cyrus the Great Emperor of Persia? Right, 500s BCE. So if the cylinder was made around the time that Cyrus the Great was Emperor of Persia, does that make the cylinder a primary source or a secondary source?
Primary?
Yes, it's a primary source because it was made during that time period. So in this case, the cylinder is a primary source because it is a monument made in Persia during the 500s BCE. Now, if the text said that it was a monument made in the 1900s that was put up as a memorial,
It'd be secondary.
it would be a secondary source. You're absolutely correct. All right, very good. So the easiest way to differentiate between primary sources and secondary sources is ask yourself the question, was this source made during the time that the event is being described, or was it made after the fact talking about a past event? If it was made during the time, in most cases it will be a primary source. If it's describing past events or people from the past, it is most likely a secondary source.